The echoes of Blackwood Manor. The rain did not fall in Blackwood. It seemed to bleed from a bruised purple sky, soaking the ancient timber of the valley and turning the single dirt road into a quagmire of black mud. Thomas Reed adjusted the collar of his wool coat, his fingers numb from the damp chill. He stood before the iron gates of Blackwood Manor, a sprawling Victorian monstrosity that sat atop the hill like a crouched predator. The stone facade was choked with dead ivy, and the windows were dark, reflecting nothing but the oppressive grey clouds above. Thomas was a man of logic. As an archivist for the London Historical Society, his world was built on parchment, ink, and verifiable dates. Ghosts, curses, and ancestral maledictions were the provinces of the uneducated, or so he had told himself when he accepted the commission to catalogue the library of the late Lord Arthur Blackwood. The pay was triple his usual rate, a sum large enough to clear his sister's medical debts. He pushed the gate. It groaned, a long metallic shriek that echoed across the empty valley. Part 1. The House of Silent Clocks. The interior of the manor smelled of dust, beeswax, and a faint sweet rot that Thomas couldn't quite place. Mr. Harrison, the skeletal caretaker who had met him at the door, carried a single sputtering oil lamp. He had not spoken a word since Thomas arrived, merely nodding and gesturing for Thomas to follow. "The library is on the second floor, Mr. Reed," Harrison finally rasped, his voice sounding like dry leaves scraping across stone. "Lord Blackwood was a meticulous collector. You will find everything as he left it. I must warn you, however, do not wander the halls after the grandfather clock in the foyer strikes midnight." Thomas smiled faintly, shaking off the chill. "And why is that, Mr. Harrison? Are the floors unstable?" Harrison stopped on the landing, the amber light of the lamp casting long, distorted shadows up the wall. He turned his milky eyes toward Thomas. "The floors are solid, sir. It is the time that is unstable." Without another word, the old man handed Thomas a heavy brass key and a box of matches, then retreated down the dark corridor, his footsteps fading into nothingness long before he could have reached the stairs. The library was breathtaking. 2 stories tall, lined with towering mahogany bookshelves that held thousands of leather-bound volumes. A massive stone fireplace dominated the far wall, flanked by 2 velvet armchairs. In the center of the room sat a heavy oak desk, upon which rested a ledger, an inkwell, and a bizarre brass artifact, a complex arrangement of interlocking gears and rings, resembling a highly sophisticated astrolabe, but with no celestial markings. Thomas set his leather satchel down and approached the desk. He picked up the brass device. It was surprisingly heavy, and as he turned it in his hands, he felt a faint rhythmic vibration, like a mechanical heartbeat. Tick, tick, tick. He frowned. There were no batteries, no wound springs visible. He set it down, assuming it was a residual kinetic motion from his handling of it. He opened the ledger. The first page was written in Lord Blackwood's erratic, spidery handwriting. "They do not live in the spaces we see, but in the seconds we discard. The ticks between the talks. I have built the key, but the lock is in the blood." Thomas sighed. "Madness," he muttered to himself. "The classic eccentricity of isolated nobility." He pulled out a blank cataloging sheet, dipped his quill into the ink, and began to work. Part 2. The Discarded Seconds. By 11 p.m., the rain had intensified, lashing against the leaded glass windows. Thomas had catalogued 43 rare manuscripts on early European occultism and medieval architecture. His eyes were strained, and his shoulders ached. He stood up to stretch, his gaze drifting to the grandfather clock standing in the corner of the library. It was a beautiful piece of craftsmanship, carved from dark walnut. But as Thomas looked closer, he realized something strange. The clock had no hands, yet, as he stood in the silence of the room, he could hear it. Tick, tick, tick. The sound was louder now, not coming just from the clock, but from the walls, from the floorboards, from the very air around him. He shook his head, blaming fatigue. He walked over to the fireplace to stoke the dying embers. As he bent down, the fire suddenly died. Not faded, but snapped out of existence, instantly replaced by cold gray ash. The temperature in the room plummeted. Thomas's breath plumed in white clouds before him. Then, the grandfather clock began to chime. It didn't ring with a metallic bell. It was a deep, resonant boom that vibrated in Thomas's chest. 1, 2, 3. With every chime, the shadows in the room seemed to stretch and twist, pulling away from the walls like black silk. 10, 11, 12. The final chime struck. Silence rushed back into the room, so absolute that Thomas could hear the rushing of his own blood in his ears. Then came the sound. Scratch, scratch, scratch. It was coming from inside the oak desk. Thomas froze. His heart hammered against his ribs. He crept toward the desk, his boots making no sound on the heavy rug. The scratching was frantic now, like an animal trying to claw its way out of a wooden box. He reached out, his hand trembling, and pulled open the central drawer. Inside lay the brass astrolabe device. The interlocking rings were spinning rapidly in opposite directions, a blur of polished metal. But that wasn't what caught Thomas's breath. Lying beneath the device was a photograph. It hadn't been there when he arrived. He picked it up. It was a black and white photograph of the very library he was standing in. Sitting in the velvet armchair by the fireplace was a man with his back to the camera, but standing directly behind the armchair was a figure. It was impossibly tall, its limbs elongated and bent at unnatural angles. It had no face, only a smooth, pale oval of flesh where features should be, and its long needle-like fingers were resting on the man's shoulders. Thomas dropped the photograph. As it fluttered to the desk, he noticed the ink on the ledger page had changed. The original writing was gone. In its place, freshly written in wet, glistening ink, was a single sentence: "Turn around. Wait a buquenies." The architecture of the dark. Thomas didn't turn around. Every instinct screaming within his logical mind told him to run. He bolted for the heavy oak doors of the library, flung them open, and burst into the corridor. The hallway was different. When he had walked up earlier, the walls were covered in green damask wallpaper. Now the wallpaper was stripped away, revealing raw, rotting lath and plaster. The air was thick with the stench of stagnant water and old copper. "Harrison," Thomas shouted, his voice cracking. "Harrison, help!" No answer. Only the distant mocking echo of his own voice. He ran toward where the staircase should have been, but the corridor seemed to stretch infinitely into the darkness. The doors he passed were no longer the uniform bedroom doors of the manor. Some were massive iron-studded barriers. Others were tiny, waist-high hatches that leaked a thick black fluid. He stopped, gasping for air, his lungs burning. He looked down at his watch. The second hand was spinning backward. Tick, tick, tick. The sound was right behind him. Thomas spun around, his back hitting the damp wall. The corridor was empty, but as he watched, a shadow detached itself from the far end of the hall. It didn't walk. It jerked forward, its movements violent and unnatural, like a marionette being pulled by broken strings. It was the figure from the photograph. Its long, spindly legs snapped into place with every step, a sickening crack of bone echoing through the silence. Thomas let out a choked cry and ran in the opposite direction. He tore open the first door he reached and threw himself inside, slamming it shut and throwing his weight against it. He was back in the library. He gasped, spinning around. How he had run down a straight corridor away from this room. Yet, here he was. The fire was still cold ash. The ledger still sat open on the desk, and the brass device was still spinning. "You cannot leave through space," a voice whispered. It didn't come from the room. It came from inside his own head, spoken in a voice that sounded like a chorus of overlapping whispers. "The house is no longer in Blackwood Valley, Thomas. It is 1884. It is 1923. It is 2026. It is never. It is always." Thomas staggered back, his head throbbing. He grabbed the brass device from the desk and hurled it against the stone fireplace. It struck with a loud clang, but it didn't break. It didn't even stop spinning. It bounced off the stone and rolled to a stop at the feet of the velvet armchair. Sitting in the armchair was a corpse.
Part 4. The man in the chair. The body was in an advanced state of decay. The skin turned to gray parchment stretched tightly over a skull. It wore a Victorian tailored suit, now moth-eaten and covered in dust. Thomas backed away, his knees shaking so violently he could barely stand. "Lord Blackwood," he breathed. The corpse's jaw clicked open. It didn't move its lips. They were gone. But the whispers filled the room again, emanating from the hollow chest cavity. "I wanted to conquer time, Thomas. I thought if I could isolate the seconds between the ticking of the clock, I could live forever. I built the chronoscope. I turned the key." The corpse's hand, a bundle of yellowed bones, slowly lifted and pointed a finger toward the ceiling. "But the spaces between are not empty. They have owners. Things that have lived in the dark since before the sun was formed. They do not eat flesh, Thomas. They eat history. They eat your memories, your past, your potential. They eat your time." Thomas looked up. The ceiling of the library was gone. In its place was a vast, swirling vortex of black gears and grinding stone wheels, stretching up into an infinite, starless void. Down from the vortex hung hundreds of long, pale cords, like umbilical cords made of spun silver. Each cord was attached to a human figure, suspended in the dark, their bodies twitching in a perpetual, silent agony. One of the cords was dangling directly above Thomas. It was lowering, its frayed end writhing like a hungry worm. "No," Thomas whimpered. He fell to his knees, clawing at his head. "This isn't real. I am a man of science. I am an archivist. This is a hallucination. The mold, the gas. Logic is a fragile raft on an ocean of chaos, young man." The whispers mocked. The pale figure from the corridor entered the library. It didn't use the door. It simply tore itself out from the shadows beneath the desk. It loomed over Thomas, its faceless head tilting to the side with a horrific, insectoid curiosity. It reached out with its long, needle-sharp fingers. Thomas tried to scream, but before the sound could leave his throat, the creature's fingers pierced his temples. Part 5. The Interlocking Cog. There was no pain, only a profound, terrifying emptiness. Instantly, Thomas saw his life flashing before him, but it was being pulled out of him. He saw his 8th birthday, blowing out candles on a chocolate cake. The memory turned gray, then withered into dust and vanished. He saw his sister, smiling from her hospital bed, telling him she felt better. The memory was ripped away, leaving a gaping black hole in his mind. He forgot her name. He forgot the color of her eyes. He forgot London. He forgot the taste of coffee. He forgot his own face. With every memory devoured, his body grew lighter, his flesh tightening against his bones, his blood drying into black powder. He was being pulled up. He looked down and saw his own body, a hollowed-out husk dressed in a modern wool coat, sitting in the second velvet armchair across from Lord Blackwood. His consciousness was sucked up into the silver cord, plugged directly into the massive, grinding gears of the void. He was now a cog in the machine, a battery of pure time, being drained second by second, eternity by eternity. Epilogue. The rain had stopped in Blackwood Valley. The morning sun broke through the clouds, casting a bright, cheerful light over the green hills. A sleek black carriage pulled up to the iron gates of Blackwood Manor. A young man stepped out, holding a leather satchel and a letter of introduction. He was an archivist from Edinburgh, hired by the estate's lawyers to catalogue the library of the late Lord Arthur Blackwood. He pushed open the gate. It swung shut behind him with a gentle click. He walked up the steps and knocked on the heavy oak door. It was opened by a skeletal old caretaker with milky eyes. "Welcome to Blackwood Manor, sir," Mr. Harrison said, his voice like dry leaves. "The library is on the 2nd floor. You will find everything as they left it." The young man smiled, stepping into the warm foyer. "Thank you. I brought my own ledger. I hope to finish the cataloging within a week." "Take all the time you need, sir," Harrison replied, a faint, terrifying smile touching his lips. "We have nothing but time here." Upstairs, in the silent library, the grandfather clock stood against the wall. It had no hands. On the desk, The brass astrolabe device sat perfectly still. But on the floor, next to two velvet armchairs holding two distinct skeletons in different styles of clothing, lay a new photograph. It showed the library, bright and empty. But if one looked closely at the glass of the window in the photograph, they could see three faces reflecting in the dark. And from the walls, so soft it could be mistaken for the wind, came the sound. Tick, tick, tick.